A year into his grueling job, a man found himself in the middle of a PR nightmare. Two young women, both hitchhikers, had been murdered in rural areas. One case, Jolie Trulson's, was still unsolved. The other, Mary Schleeze, was finally showing signs of closure. But the pressure from above was reaching boiling point. Chief Crawford made the position clear. An arrest had to be made and a conviction secured in order to restore confidence among the public. Justice had to be swift. On a cold morning in March, a small convoy of official vehicles broke the silence of a secluded lane in St. Croix County. Out came Detective Craig Kozer, along with Sheriff Garrett Hines and Deputy Larry Sanders, to approach Lenny's rundown house. Startled, Lenny stepped outside. Already pale, his face went ashen when the officers read him his charges. There was no struggle, just stunned silence. He was taken to the Dunn County Sheriff's Office and led into a small, sterile interrogation room. The air smelled of stale coffee, heavy with tension. Across from him, Detective Kozer sat, notepad open, eyes steady. From the other side of the one-way mirror, Sheriff Hines watched silently, an imposing presence. "Mr. Croft," Kozer began, his voice calm, "we believe you have information about the murder of Mary Kathleen Schleeze." Lenny twisted in his seat, playing with a loose thread on his trouser leg. "I already told you. I don't know anything about that." Kozer didn't bat an eye. "We found a pack of Marlboro Reds in your car," he said matter-of-factly, "and a cigarette butt from the same brand was found near Mary's body. Your tires match the tracks we found at the scene. And besides, you match the description of the man Dennis Brown saw arguing with Mary that day." Lenny's eyes scanned the room, refusing to meet Kozer's. "That doesn't mean anything. Lots of people smoke Marlboro Reds. My car? It's just a yellow sedan. Nothing special," he muttered, the words almost lost under his thin veil of denial. Kozer leaned forward in his chair. "Then tell us, where were you on February 15th, 1974, between 10:30 a.m. and 1:30 p.m.? Give us an alibi." Lenny's face crumpled. He opened his mouth, then closed it, shaking his head. I can't. I won't," he stammered. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I want a lawyer." His silence and refusal to cooperate only hardened the resolve of the investigators. City police, working under Chief Crawford's urgent mandate, coordinated efforts with other authorities to ensure Leonard Croft would face trial quickly. Within weeks, the grand, imposing St. Croix County Courthouse, with its stone columns and echoing hallways, was alive with tension. The courtroom was packed, reflecting the community's thirst for answers. Reporters jostled for space, cameras flashing, as Mary's parents, Michael and Penelope Schleeze, and her brother Don took their seats in the front row, their eyes locking on Lenny in a mixture of grief and simmering anger. District Attorney Cole Maddox, sharp and ambitious, opened the state's case with chilling precision. He painted Leonard Croft as a reclusive, evasive man who preyed on a vulnerable young woman and then callously discarded her body. Each piece of circumstantial evidence was placed like threads in a damning tapestry. Then Dana Whitlock, Lenny's defense attorney, rose. A diligent but overworked public defender, she had an uphill battle. The public had already convicted her client of the crime. In her opening statement, she tried to temper expectations. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady, though there was tension, "the prosecution will present a case built upon suspicion, on coincidence, on assumptions. But suspicion, however strong, is not proof. Coincidence, however unsettling, is not fact." The trial was like something out of a tense procedural drama. Maddox called his first witness, Kathy Hobley. Nervous and fidgety, Kathy recounted her call to the St. Croix Sheriff's Office, describing her neighbor Leonard Croft and his unsettling resemblance to the composite sketch. Maddox carefully led her testimony, underscoring her conscientious nature and sense of civic duty. Dana Whitlock stood up to cross-examine. "Miss Hobley," she said briskly, "you testified that you saw a sketch in the newspaper. You did not, in fact, witness the crime, correct?" I just saw the picture," Kathy confessed, wringing her hands. "And you testified that Mr. Croft owns a yellow sedan, not a gold one, correct?" "Yes. Yellow," Kathy confirmed, eyes darting nervously. "But it looked similar in the snow." Dana let the implication hang in the air. So your testimony rests on a resemblance to a drawing and a car color that could be misleading due to lighting conditions. She released the witness, letting the point sink in. Next to testify was forensic technician Warren Dade. He testified about finding the Marlboro Red cigarette butt near Mary's body and the tricky tire tracks. Maddox introduced low-resolution photos and asked, "Were these findings consistent with evidence later collected from the defendant's vehicle?" "Yes, sir," said Dade, lean and serious. "The brand of cigarette was the same as a pack found in Mr. Croft's sedan. The tire tread patterns and dimensions were consistent with his vehicle." Dana got up to cross-examine him, steeling herself for the challenge ahead. Dana Whitlock's voice was measured, but her questions had a quiet intensity. "How many brands of cigarettes were sold in Minnesota in 1974, Mr. Dade?" Warren Dade blinked, taken aback. I couldn't say precisely, ma'am. Many Marlboro Reds were among the most popular, smoked by millions, widely available." "Exactly," Dana pressed, gentle but firm. "So the presence of a Marlboro Red at a crime scene isn't exactly unique, is it?" Dade hesitated, uneasy under her steady regard. "No, ma'am. And those tire tracks," she added, her voice rising just enough to command attention, "they're not a definitive match. Either millions of cars share similar patterns." "True," Dade conceded, the weight of her implications settling over him. "The overall impression is consistent, but not conclusive." With a small, defiant victory in the set of her shoulders, Dana sat back down. Outside the courtroom, however, the prosecution's story, always helped along by Chief Crawford's relentless push for closure, was beginning to take root. More of Maddox's witnesses took the stand, each of them depicting Lenny as reclusive, evasive, and ultimately guilty. The jurors, a crop of local citizens, exchanged knowing glances, their growing conviction palpable by the third day. During a tense recess, Dana Whitlock's face was grim. She discovered Leonard in a small deliberation room, hunched over, his anxiety palpable. "Lenny," she said in a low, urgent voice that was never accusatory, "they're going to convict you for murder. My attempts to discredit the circumstantial evidence, valid as they are, aren't enough. The jury believes you're hiding something. We have to tell them the truth about Owatonna. This is our last chance." Lenny's red-rimmed eyes met hers, his face a mask of fear and dread. To be forced to reveal his cowardice, his past mistake, had terrified him. But the alternative was a murder conviction. He took a deep, shuddering breath, then another. "All right, Dana," he muttered, his voice shaking. "All right, tell them." The trial resumed, and the packed courtroom fell silent. In a surprise turn of events, Leonard Croft, led by Dana, stood before Judge Amelia Holloway and the jury. "I wasn't in Wisconsin that day," he admitted in a near whisper, his eyes appealing for understanding as they found his wife, Cecilia, in the gallery. I was on that highway. I lied because I caused an accident." He said that on the morning of February 15th, he had been driving his yellow sedan on a sales route. Sometime around 11 a.m., on a part of Interstate 35 south of Minneapolis, near Owatonna, he had clipped a motorcyclist. The rider went tumbling onto the shoulder, panicked and uninsured. Lenny had sped away, heart racing with shame and fear. He drove home and scrubbed his car, desperate to erase the mistake. "I was a coward," he said, with tears streaking his face. "I was more than 100 miles away from where that poor girl was found. I didn't kill anyone. I was afraid to admit the hit and run." His confession seemed to hang in the air, a pitiful explanation of his evasiveness. But to the jury, already swayed by circumstantial evidence and prior denials, it sounded like a desperate fabrication of a story, a hit-and-run lie to avoid shame that conveniently coincided with a murder investigation. It seemed too convenient, too outlandish. Jurors exchanged skeptical glances. Judge Holloway reminded them to weigh all testimony, but it was obvious Leonard's confession had done more harm than good. After just a few hours in deliberation, the jury returned. Foreman Franklin Stone stood hunched over, stone-faced, speaking clearly. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant, Leonard Croft, not guilty. On the lesser charge of second-degree murder, We find the defendant, Leonard Croft, guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Not first degree, but still, a conviction. Judge Holloway sentenced Leonard Croft to 30 years in state prison. The gavel struck a sharp, final note, echoing the end of the initial hunt for Mary Kathleen Schleeze's killer whisked away to Minnesota State Prison in Stillwater. Leonard's world was reduced to cold concrete walls and iron bars. Around Minnesota, there was a cautious sigh of relief. Headlines proclaimed, "Schleeze's killer jailed. Justice prevails." In the case of Mary's parents, Michael and Penelope Schleeze, a profound, though painful sense of closure settled over them. Yet 8 months later, that fragile peace shattered. The ever-tenacious Dana Whitlock filed a petition for post-conviction relief, arguing that newly discovered evidence required reopening the case. The community was stunned. Why challenge what had seemed a settled conviction? The story behind this evidence began to emerge. All those months, Leonard's wife, Cecilia Croft, had refused to believe he was capable of murder. She remembered that February night in 1974, the frantic, tearful confession about the hit and run, his desperate attempts to clean his car. She embarked on a tireless, painstaking search to find the motorcyclist involved that day. The task was monumental. The accident had occurred on a remote stretch of Interstate 35 in southern Minnesota, and the stretch of Interstate 35 in southern Minnesota cuts through so many jurisdictions, making the task of identifying a long-missing motorcyclist from a 1974 hit-and-run all but impossible. Yet for months, Cecilia Croft and Dana Whitlock pursued every lead, poring over old police reports, calling law enforcement across southern Minnesota, and even placing classified ads in local newspapers. Finally, persistence paid off. With the help of the Minnesota State Patrol, they tracked down the accident report and eventually located the motorcyclist himself. His name was Derek Langston, now living quietly in a small town in Illinois. Dana and Cecilia made the long journey, persuading Derek to testify. Though decades had dulled some details, the core facts remained clear. On February 15, 1974, he indeed had been involved in a minor hit-and-run with a yellow sedan on that very stretch of highway near Owatonna. He remembered the driver speeding away in a panic. His injuries had been minor, and he'd reported the accident at the time, but the driver was never found. The court granted Dana's petition, and a new hearing was scheduled. Leonard Croft took his place in a courtroom again after less than a year since his conviction, this time thinner and paler. There was no jury this time, only Judge Amelia Holloway, who was to consider the new evidence. Derek Langston testified with quiet sincerity. He spoke of the accident, the yellow sedan, the date, and the panicked driver. His story was corroborated, detail for detail, by the original Minnesota police report. Previously unconnected with the case, an alibi the jury once thought a desperate lie now stood tragically and undeniably true. Grim realization weighed upon Judge Holloway's face as she looked down at Leonard Mr. Croft. She said with a heavy voice, "The evidence presented today irrevocably proves your whereabouts on February 15, 1974, at the time Miss Schleeze was murdered. While your actions in Iowa that day were reprehensible, they do not make you responsible for this heinous crime." Exhaling deeply, she ordered Leonard Croft to be exonerated at once. The news ripped through Minnesota like wildfire, and the resulting public outcry overshadowed any feelings of relief. Headlines yelled, "Innocent man imprisoned, Schleeze's killer still free," and "Justice system falters, police pressure led to wrongful conviction." A torrent of criticism at every level was heaped upon the police and the courts, and demands for resignations poured in from citizenry and politicians alike. Chief James C. Crawford was already under scrutiny. Now the challenge before him was insurmountable. In a somber news conference at the State Patrol headquarters, a drawn, weary Crawford spoke to a sea of reporters. "A grave injustice has occurred today," he said in a voice low but firm. "On behalf of the Minnesota State Patrol, the Minneapolis Police Department, and the entire law enforcement community, I extend our deepest, most profound apologies to Mr. Leonard Croft and his family. We failed him. We failed in our duty to uphold justice impartially. We will learn from this, and we will not rest until the true killer of Mary Kathleen Schleeze is brought to justice." For the Schleeze family, the relief of having a killer caught was replaced almost immediately by renewed despair. Michael and Penelope, along with their son Don, were plunged back into the agonizing uncertainty they thought they had left behind. Mary's case was back to square one, a grim, unsolved murder now complicated by the stain of a profound injustice. Files once stamped, closed with a false sense of resolution, were reopened, stamped active, unsolved. On the heels of Leonard Croft's exoneration, unanswered questions about who killed Mary, along with rampant public distrust, cast a long, cold shadow over this region. The state was still trying to come to terms with the earlier, equally mysterious disappearance of Jolie Trolson, and now it seemed mired in a series of unsettling, unsolved crimes. In the years subsequent to Mary's murder and Lenny's wrongful conviction, several other young women either disappeared or were found murdered along rural highways in Wisconsin and Minnesota. None were definitively linked to Mary's case, but the pattern deepened the chilling sense that a predator roamed the isolated stretches of the Midwest. It was reopened several times, and with each flare of hope, it seemed, came the familiar dead ends. In the early 1980s, a new theory emerged, spurred by national headlines. Mary's killer might have been Randall Woodfield, a notorious serial murderer terrorizing the Pacific Northwest. Woodfield had confessed to at least 44 killings, many of his victims hitchhikers, making him a chillingly logical suspect in Mary's case. Detective Rachel Denham, an industrious cold case investigator who had taken over Mary's case file, examined Woodfield's movements and modus operandi. Yet despite the haunting similarities, no concrete link emerged. There was no geographical overlap, no alibi placing Woodfield in Wisconsin on February 15, 1974, and no DNA from Mary's scene to compare. Over time, the lead faded into the archives. For decades, investigators from Dunn County and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension chased hundreds of additional leads, their work taking them across nearly every U.S. state and even into Canada. Yet Mary Kathleen Schleeze's killer remained elusive. Investigators pursued whispers and faint shadows, but the real identity of Mary's killer remained maddeningly elusive. Time worked against them. Memories faded, witnesses aged, and the forensic tools of the 20th century were frustratingly limited. What had begun as a raw, tragic story gradually turned into a chilling, local legend. In Dunn County, especially in the quiet rural stretches where Mary's body had been found, the story took on an almost supernatural life. People began reporting strange sightings. A slender young woman with long hair, walking silently along the roadside with her thumb out, trying to hitch a ride. But the moment a driver looked away, she would vanish, leaving only the biting wind in her wake. Two local fishermen, Byron and Warren, swore they had seen the figure of a woman near a secluded lake, phosphorescent in the dark, standing silently for several moments before melting into the fog. Soon after, a fervent villager, Morgana, stated that Mary herself had appeared to her in a vivid dream, begging for justice. These paranormal stories, fueled by decades of unresolved grief, eventually became more famous than the crime itself. Many locals, especially younger ones, never realized that behind the ghostly tales lay a brutal, real-life tragedy and a family's 50 years of unrelenting sorrow. Mary Kathleen Schleeze, a vibrant artist with a passion for life, became more than a victim. She became a fixture in the cold case files, a lasting testament to justice denied. Sheriff Hines retired in the late 1980s. His career was forever overshadowed by Mary's unsolved murder. Now a seasoned lieutenant, Detective Kozer carried the memory like an unhealed scar, serving under a succession of new sheriffs. As the 1990s faded into a new millennium, investigative technology slowly advanced, but not fast enough. DNA profiling was still in its infancy and was not yet routine in cold cases, let alone genetic genealogy, which was barely more than a whisper on the horizon. Mary's homicide file grew thicker and heavier with time. Pages yellowed and brittle. Polaroids faded to sepia tones. The case moved from active shelves to locked storage, eventually down to the basement archives of the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. Then, in the early 2000s, a flicker of hope appeared. The rise of DNA analysis was transforming law enforcement, cracking cases once thought impossible. Inspired by these breakthroughs, Sheriff Graham Tully authorized a renewed look at Mary's case. He assigned Lieutenant Rowena Pierce, known for her relentless persistence, to lead the effort. By the time Pierce opened the aging file, decades of unanswered questions pressed down on her like a weight. She consulted experts at the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and made a bold decision. The body of Mary would be exhumed in 2009. For Don Schleeze and his parents, Michael and Penelope, it was heartbreaking. Exhuming Mary's grave was like reopening wounds that had lain undisturbed for decades, but hope outweighed hesitation. Maybe finally modern science could give Mary a voice. Her remains were carefully examined by forensic specialists for traces beneath her fingernails and signs of defensive wounds that would indicate some struggle. But despite painstaking work, the DNA was too degraded, too compromised by time and burial. The results were inconclusive. It was a devastating setback. Still, Pierce refused to give up. One piece of evidence had survived intact: the distinctive orange and black knit cap found near Mary's body, with several short strands of male hair clinging to it. Forensic technician Darren Cole re-examined the cap using improved DNA extraction techniques. His team successfully pulled a partial YSTR DNA profile, a male-specific genetic signature that could trace paternal lineage. It wasn't complete, but it was something tangible, a fragment of the killer's identity. Pierce immediately submitted the profile to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS. Weeks of anxious waiting followed as hope flickered against decades of frustration. Then came the answer: no match. The killer's DNA wasn't in the system. He had never been caught, never convicted. He was still out there. The disappointment was deep, yet the result wasn't meaningless. The partial profile allowed investigators to eliminate several long-standing suspects. Randall Woodfield, the notorious serial killer, was conclusively ruled out. Dennis Brown and Walter Henderson were excluded. Leonard Croft, already exonerated years earlier, was now scientifically cleared beyond any doubt. These exclusions brought some clarity, if not closure. The case was narrower now, but the puzzle still was missing its final piece. Years slipped away. In 2016, Michael Schleeze died, taking with him the question of who killed his daughter. Penelope followed in 2019, carrying her grief to her grave. Only Don Schleeze remained, still writing letters, making calls, visiting the sheriff's office every February 15th. His hair had turned silver, but his resolve never wavered. Justice was a duty now, a promise inherited from his parents, one he could not let go. By the early 2020s, Captain Rowena Pierce of the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension still carried Mary's file in her briefcase, a silent reminder of unfinished work. The partial DNA profile sat in CODIS, waiting for a match that might never come. Despite every leap in forensic technology, the case remained frozen, as if the truth itself had chosen to stay buried. In late 2022, inspired by breakthroughs elsewhere around the country, Chief Julian Rivers of the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, an insightful leader deeply invested in cold cases, made a bold decision. She authorized the BCA to revisit Mary Kathleen Schleeze's murder, declaring it their absolute last real chance. Captain Rowena Pierce felt a surge of hope again, this time mixed with Captain Julian Rivers, bearing the brunt of professional exhaustion, was in for leading this massive effort. She entrusted it with her most indefatigable investigators, Detective Sergeant Isolde Cross, sharp and fastidious, and Detective Quentin Lowe, a younger, technology-savvy detective noted for relentless persistence. 50 years, Detective Lowe said, sweeping his arm toward the thick file on the conference table. 50 years, and still nothing solid. 50 years, Captain Pierce countered, her gaze firm. And now we have a tool that didn't exist for 45 of them. This isn't just another cold case. It's a second chance at justice for Mary, for the Schleeze family, and even for Leonard Croft. First, they teamed up with the Forensic Genetics Center at Ramapo College in New Jersey. That's where they met Dr. Annika Sharma, one of the top forensic geneticists in the country, who leads a team of specialists working on the extraction of DNA in difficult cold case cases. Dr. Sharma's team took the precious hair strands from Mary's orange and black knit cap, preserved since 1974. The challenge was immense. Partial DNA, degraded, fragile with age. Yet after months of painstaking work, Dr. Sharma and her lead genetic genealogist, Kaylin Reese, managed to construct a comprehensive, forensic-grade genome sequence. This wasn't just a CODIS profile, it was a full genetic blueprint, rich with ancestral markers. With the genetic profile in hand, Reese and her team embarked on a grueling journey through public genealogy databases. It was like piecing together a big jigsaw puzzle with so many fragments missing, tracing back distant cousins, cross-referencing old obituaries, census records, and public documents. Weeks of tireless work finally bore fruit, a potential family line rooted deep in rural Minnesota and Wisconsin. From there, genealogists compiled a list of possible suspects, those whose family trees intersected with that of the unknown DNA donor. The leads were given to Detective Sergeant Cross and Detective Lowe, a cautious excitement in their eyes. Their initial focuses went to just two individuals, Mateo Vargas and Laszlo Kovacs. Both men were distant cousins in the identified family line, lived in the region in 1974, and broadly matched the age criteria. Surveillance started. The detectives retrieved tossed DNA, Mateo's discarded coffee cup from the local diner, Laszlo's water bottle from a community event. Days later, lab results arrived. Both Mateo Vargas and Laszlo Kovacs were definitively excluded. That first balloon of hope had finally deflated. They'd found relatives, but not the killer. "It's a close relative," Kaylin Reese said over a video call, her tone tinged with professional frustration. "But there's no one else in their known family tree who could be the suspect. We've hit a wall with standard genealogy." Then Dr. Sharma put forward an important new theory. "What if," she suggested in a quiet but firm tone, "the killer had been adopted? It would explain why he doesn't appear anywhere in the family tree we've built. His biological lineage is clear, but his legal identity might be separate, breaking the chain in public databases." The adoption theory sent a jolt through the cold case unit. It was logical but highly challenging. Digging through decades-old, often sealed adoption records means complex legal and logistical hurdles, an undertaking that could stretch months, maybe years. Privacy laws from the 1970s made access exceedingly difficult, but it was the only remaining path. Captain Pierce, not looking away from Mary's fading photograph, gave the order, "Find him. Whatever it takes, find him." The team embarked on an arduous, meticulous, legally fraught search through historical adoption records across Minnesota and Wisconsin. Names and dates were cross-referenced tirelessly, each document bringing them closer to bridging the genealogical gap. It wasn't until nearly a year later, working with Dr. Junior Morrow, a legal genealogist specializing in historical adoptions, that they found what they were looking for. A strong probability emerged. The biological relative serving as missing link in the family tree was an 84-year-old man named John Keith Miller. That identification sent a quiet ripple of awe and grim satisfaction through the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and Cold Case Unit. 50 years it had taken to put a name to the man whose DNA sat silent and unknown in a knit cap since 1974. Detective Sergeant Cross and Detective Lowe were immediately assigned to investigate John Keith Miller. Born in 1940 and living in Owatonna, Minnesota, he had led a very nondescript life. He was 34 at the time of Mary's murder, well within the age range described by Dennis Brown. Miller's background, pieced painstakingly together, showed a life lived quietly, off the fringes of public record. Transient construction and maintenance jobs, a few minor arrests for public intoxication and disorderly conduct. Nothing that would have put his DNA in CODIS. He seemed ordinary, a ghost in the system, slipping through every traditional net. Cross and Lowe instituted discreet surveillance. Days were spent observing his routine, weekly trips to the small grocery store, quiet afternoons on the porch, occasional visits from his daughter. They moved with methodical, almost invisible precision, in the full realization of the emotional weight this moment was to carry, not for Mary's family alone, but also for the justice system itself. They knew Leonard Croft had been wrongly imprisoned, So they had to wait for surefire evidence before they could apprehend the actual suspect one November morning in 2024. Their patience finally paid off. Detectives watched as John Keith Miller's daughter, Sophia Miller Jensen, left a local coffee shop. As she walked to her car, she discarded a half-empty cup into a public trash bin. In gloved and quick fashion, Detective Lowe retrieved it. That ordinary-appearing coffee cup was rushed to the BCA crime lab. This indirect method of collecting DNA from a close biological relative was one step in a carefully calculated process before directly approaching the elderly suspect. Days later, the lab results arrived. Captain Rowena Pierce gathered her team, their faces tense with anticipation that had stretched half a century. The phone crackled. "Captain, the DNA profile from Sophia Miller Jensen is a 99.9999% match to the YSTR profile pulled from the knit cap. John Keith Miller is, without a shadow of a doubt, the biological father of the individual whose DNA was found at the crime scene. We have our killer." The room fell into profound silence. 50 years of agony, frustration, and hope came to that very moment. John Keith Miller, a name once utterly unknown, now carried with it the horrifying truth. After 5 long decades, Mary Kathleen Schleeze finally had a name for her killer. News was immediately conveyed to 78-year-old Don Schleeze in his quiet Minneapolis home. His hands shook, and tears welled up in his eyes as he listened to the news. It had taken 50 years, and his parents, Michael and Penelope, had gone to their graves without this answer. A heavy, bittersweet sense of relief mixed with sadness. Finally, this long, silent vigil was about to end. 50 years and 8 months after the brutal taking of Mary's life, on the morning of November 7th, 2024, the quiet suburban street in Owatonna, Minnesota, where John Keith Miller resided, awoke to discreet yet purposeful activity. Detective Sergeant Isolde Cross, Detective Quentin Lowe, and a small contingent from Minnesota BCA made their way to Miller's modest and well-kept residence. The door was answered by Miller, 84 himself. Frail, stooped, with a long white beard and thinning hair framing a deeply lined face, his pale eyes, though dulled with age, still carried an alertness. He looked more like a reclusive farmer than the man investigators had hunted for over half a century. The detectives introduced themselves in a very calm manner, badges discreetly shown, and asked to speak with him inside. Miller, perhaps accustomed to minor brushes with authority when he was younger, agreed without apparent apprehension. They led him to a small, sterile interrogation room at the Owatonna Police Department. The air, devoid of the familiar smells of his home, hummed with a different tension. Detective Sergeant Cross spoke first. Her voice was measured as Detective Lowe put a solitary object on the table between them, the orange and black knit cap, carefully preserved in an evidence bag. Its colors were as bright now as they had been 50 years earlier. "Mr. Miller," Cross started off, unflinching, "we're here to talk about Mary Kathleen Schleeze." Miller, looking utterly bewildered, shook his head. "Mary who? I don't know any Mary Schleeze. Never heard the name." His voice was husky, aged. "Mary Kathleen Schleeze," Lowe interjected, leaning slightly forward. "Murdered on February 15th, 1974, in Dunn County, Wisconsin. She was a hitchhiker." He nudged the evidence bag closer. "Does this hat look familiar to you?" Miller glanced at the cap, then quickly away. A flicker of recognition did go through his eyes, but he shook his head. "No, can't say it does. I don't wear hats like that." "We believe you were with her that day, Mr. Miller," Cross continued, voice soft but firm. "And we have irrefutable evidence. The male DNA from the hair inside this hat is a 99.9999% match to your biological lineage. Your daughter provided the sample. It's you. We know you were there." The words hung coldly in the air. For 50 years, Miller had maintained his stoic facade. Now it visibly faltered. His weathered face went ashen. His eyes widened in raw panic. The facade crumbled. A long, ragged sigh escaped him, carrying the weight of decades of unspoken secrets. "All right," he whispered, thin and tremulous. "All right. I picked her up." He leaned back in his chair, a profound weariness settling over his slight frame. When it came, his confession was chilling in its detachment, almost clinical in its monotone delivery, devoid of genuine remorse. It was February 15th, Miller recalled, staring out into space. I was driving my light blue sedan, going east on the highway out of Minneapolis. I saw her, a pretty girl with a Madison sign. I like picking up hitchhikers sometimes. Company. He paused. She talked a lot about art. Young, full of ideas. We drove for a while, got out of the city. Then his story turned dark. He said he had pressured Mary for sexual favors. His voice insistent, Mary was both brave and frightened as she refused him flat out. She told him to stop the car. I didn't, he said flatly. In one sudden rageful fit that was somehow inspired by her defiance, he reached for a knife he kept tucked near the passenger seat, a habit from transient days for opening boxes or small repairs. He plunged the knife into her repeatedly without hesitation. She just stopped fighting, he said matter-of-factly. The words spoke volumes of terror, casual brutality, a life extinguished with chilling finality. Miller described, with chilling indifference, what he had done. He drove Mary's lifeless body, slumped beside him, to an isolated rural road in Dunn County, Wisconsin, on the same dead-end path where Dennis Brown was later to make his horrifying discovery. I planned to bury her in the snow, Miller acknowledged, his voice flat, to hide everything. But as he dragged her from the car, a vehicle, a passing pickup truck, drove by. Panicked and terrified of being caught, he jumped back into his light blue sedan and sped off, abandoning Mary's body by the roadside. The following day, Miller continued, a faint knowing look in his eyes. I saw the newspaper about the body. They said the witness saw a gold-colored car. I felt relieved. My car was light blue. They got it wrong. No one would ever connect it to me. That small discrepancy, the car color, had provided him a false sense of security for 5 decades, a cruel trick of fate that had allowed him to walk free. He could only vaguely recall throwing the knife into a swamp near his house sometime after the crime. He also was unable to say what became of Mary's purse. Miller denied involvement with other murders, including that of Jolie Trulson. No, just her, he said, his tone chillingly simple. Don't even really understand why I did it in the first place. No flicker of remorse, no hint of guilt, only a cold, clinical account of a life extinguished and the decades of silence that followed. With his confession, the decades-long mystery was finally horrifyingly solved. Charges against John Keith Miller were formally issued for first-degree murder, and he was taken into custody to await trial. News of the arrest of this 84-year-old seemingly ordinary retiree exploded across Minnesota and Wisconsin. 50-year cold case cracked, DNA points to elderly man, screamed the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. The story would very quickly garner national attention, a grim testament to the relentless march of forensic science. The public felt awe mixed with horror. A killer had walked free, unnoticed, for half a century. Captain Rowena Pierce of the Minnesota BCA Cold Case Unit, along with Detective Sergeant Isolde Cross and Detective Quentin Lowe, held a press conference surrounded by a sea of microphones. Pierce's voice was clear and strong, though edged with emotion. Today, she said, we bring justice to Mary Kathleen Schleeze, 50 years after her life was brutally taken. To her brother Don and to the memory of her parents, Michael and Penelope, who passed without this answer. We hope this finally brings some measure of peace. The same day, and with the surreal news still fresh in his head, Don Schleeze met with Pierce and her team. Tears welling in his eyes, he shook their hands. My parents, they waited so long, he whispered. They died without knowing. But now Mary has justice. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for never giving up. The fragile closure that had been violently ripped away by the exoneration of Leonard Croft was finally, truly restored. For his part, Miller made plain he did not intend to fight the charges. Meeting with his court-appointed public defender, Attorney Spencer Rood, he was impassive. I told them what happened, he rasped, gaze fixed on the wall. No point in a long court process. I'm ready to spend the rest of my life in prison. His willingness to admit guilt, delivered with the same chilling detachment as his confession, simplified the legal path forward. On March 27th, 2025 more than 51 years after Mary Kathleen Schleeze's murder, John Keith Miller stood in front of Judge James Peterson in Dunn County Circuit Court. The courtroom was packed with somber people who came to witness the final act of this decades-long tragedy. Don Schleeze sat in the front row, clutching a framed picture of his sister in his hands, eyes fixed on the man who had stolen her future new prosecutor. District Attorney Daniel R. Whitmore revisited the horrors of Miller's confession and intertwined them with the power of forensic genetic genealogy that had finally unmasked him. When Judge Peterson asked Miller for his plea, the 84-year-old spoke clearly, surprisingly firm for a man of his age. "No contest, Your Honor." By entering this plea, he accepted the charges without formally admitting guilt in court, effectively sidestepping a protracted trial and proceeding directly to sentencing. Judge Peterson's face was solemn as he addressed Miller directly, his voice ringing with the weight of more than half a century of justice denied. "Mr. Miller, for 51 years, Mary Kathleen Schleeze's family has endured unimaginable suffering, compounded by the painful miscarriage of justice that saw an innocent man wrongfully imprisoned. Your cold and calculated actions, followed by decades of unrepentant silence, represent a profound evil. The truth, however long buried, has finally come to light." With solemn finality, Judge Peterson sentenced John Keith Miller to life imprisonment for first-degree murder without parole. The gavel came down with a sharp, echoing sound, marking the definitive end of Mary's tragic journey and that agonizing quest for her killer. A collective sigh whispered through the courtroom. Don Schleeze clutched the photograph tighter, one tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. Frail and 84, John Keith Miller was led away, his world finally reduced to concrete walls and iron bars, a penalty long in coming. In the end, the case of Mary Kathleen Schleeze was finally officially closed. State and federal authorities praised Captain Rowena Pierce, Detective Sergeant Isolde Cross, and Detective Quentin Lowe for tireless work and a pioneering application of genetic genealogy. The Schleeze family issued a statement in which they stated their profound gratitude to the investigators and the BCA team for never giving up on Mary. A silent retrospection remained with the case of Jolie Truelson. While a number of details of the Miller confession bore some resemblance, his very specific confession about his light blue car, a direct contradiction to the gold sedan witnessed decades earlier, validated that his actions were limited to Mary Kathleen Schleeze. There remained the tragic, still lingering question of other cases. But one thing was sure. Justice had finally arrived for Mary. Friends of Jolie Truelson confirmed that involvement by John Keith Miller was highly unlikely in her case, but investigators continued to review other unsolved disappearances and murders in Wisconsin and Minnesota from the 1970s and 80s for any possible connections to Miller. Thus far, nothing else had been definitively linked to him. Detective Sergeant Isolde Cross stood outside the Dunn County Courthouse after the verdict, the chill of the spring air mirroring the somber relief she felt. She looked across the quiet town and thought of Mary Kathleen Schleeze, perpetually 25, a bright young artist whose dreams had been brutally stolen. She considered Leonard Croft, unfairly taken from a year of his life, an innocent victim of circumstance and pressure exerted by the system. And then there was Don Schleeze, whose hope had reached across half a lifetime. This case had become Exhibit A for the enduring power of modern forensic science, particularly genetic genealogy, but it was also a jarring reminder of the fallibility of earlier investigations and the profound human cost of delayed justice. As the sun began to set, lengthening the shadows over the still plains, Cross opened her notebook and wrote one final line in the now closed file for Mary Kathleen Schleeze. Case closed, killer convicted. Justice, though delayed for 51 years, finally served. No one is ever forgotten. The truth is always out, however late. She glanced up, giving a soft nod for the memory of Mary that still lingered. "Thanks for being here, listening," she murmured. "Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care of your loved ones." On a cold winter's day in February of 1974, a young artist working her way through college disappeared hitchhiking through Minnesota. Her body was later found brutally murdered with 15 stab wounds near rural Wisconsin, Lying near her remains was a knit cap belonging to the killer that was abandoned 23 feet from her body. A local man was soon arrested and convicted of murder. But the truth came out as a grave failure of law enforcement that sent an innocent man to prison while the real killer remained hidden in plain sight, quietly watching from afar. It wasn't until 50 years later that a single hair from the knit cap finally traced the killer's family line through genetic genealogy, but the perpetrator himself was still unidentified. Then a sudden thought struck the detectives. What if the killer had been adopted? A small detail, but one crucial enough to change everything. Before we dive into this haunting story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love cases solved after decades, don't forget to hit subscribe to stay updated on more stories. Minneapolis was a city that bubbled with activity, situated among the snow-covered plains of Minnesota. The days of winter were long and biting cold. The month of February 1974 brought with it a brittle silence, where the only sound might be the distant roar of traffic or the mournful cry of a train. The frigid air smelled of pine and damp earth, a harsh reminder that spring was still a promise yet to come. In a modest apartment on the city's south side, Mary Kathleen Schleeze prepared for a trip born November 11, 1949, in the quieter town of Champlin, Minnesota. Mary was now 25. She had grown up in a large, boisterous family. Her parents, Michael and Penelope Schleeze, had always encouraged their children's passions. Her older brother Don often teased her about her intense artistic drive, but he was also her staunchest supporter. Mary's world was filled with the visceral joy of creating. Her hands, usually smudged with charcoal or clay, spoke of unyielding passion for art. She knew by high school that art for her was something more than a hobby. It was a calling. She pursued it single-mindedly, enrolling in the rigorous fine arts program at the University of Minnesota. Her teachers, artists themselves, soon took notice of that unique spark in her pieces, a mix of raw talent and almost ethereal sensitivity. She excelled in painting and sculpture, earned multiple scholarships, and graduated with honors, her pieces displayed in local exhibitions. A remarkable achievement for one so young. Mary's thirst for knowledge exceeded the canvas. She had spent a year studying abroad, emerging fluent in German and Danish, and was now meticulously learning Japanese. Every new language was another stroke of color on the bright canvas of her mind. After graduation, Mary continued to follow her artistic muse. Her life was nomadic in pursuit of inspiration. The painting provided soul-enriching satisfaction, but seldom financial comfort, and so she learned to embrace a minimalist existence, saving every spare cent to fund her travels. She shared the small apartment in Minneapolis with her friend Linnea Larson, a quiet, aspiring writer. As often as not, when the call of another city, another gallery, or another adventure beckoned, Mary relied on hitchhiking to see her through. In the mid-1970s, it wasn't the grim, frightening practice it would later become. Public transportation in many areas was limited, and sinister strangers lurking on every roadside were largely the stuff of local whispers rather than headlines. For Mary, hitchhiking was simply an efficient, economical way to traverse the country and connect with the vast American landscape and its myriad faces. Mary had planned a trip to attend an awaited art show on the morning of Friday, February 15, 1974. The distance between Minneapolis and Chicago is approximately 400 miles, an ambitious distance to cover in one stop. Hence, she was going to do it in bits. First hitchhiking to Madison, Wisconsin, then on to Chicago. At about 10:30 a.m., as she said goodbye to Linnea, carrying her knapsack easily over her shoulder, clutching a hand-lettered sign reading Madison, she skipped along toward the highway, a small plume of breath curling in the nippy air, her heart alight with artistic anticipation. About 3 hours later, more than 100 miles to the east, Dennis Brown, a rugged farmer with a face like worn leather and warm eyes, drove his pickup truck down a remote rural road, lined with snow in Dunn County, Wisconsin. The road, a narrow, packed dirt track wound through dense stands of pine and leafless hardwoods, a solitary artery cutting through the silent, white landscape. Dennis Brown, a local farmer with a weathered face and steady hands, was returning from a routine supply run to the small town of Colfax, enjoying the quiet solitude of the back roads. Somewhere along the way, he took a long, dead-end path, sometimes used to check on an old hunting blind. As his truck rounded a gentle curve, what lay before him froze him in his tracks. Parked haphazardly by the side of the road was a small gold-colored sedan, its engine off. Two figures stood beside it, a man and a woman. From Dennis's vantage point, as he drove slowly past, they seemed to be involved in a heated argument, their gestures sharp and agitated. He thought he saw a flash of struggle, but the swirling snow and distance made it impossible to be certain. A prickle of uneasiness settled in his stomach. Something was wrong. He continued to the end of the road, turned his truck around, and headed back. But when he reached the spot barely 5 minutes later, the gold sedan was gone. The only sign of its presence was a churned patch of snow. Then Dennis saw something else, a dark shape out of place against the stark white canvas. He slowed his truck, catching his breath in his throat. There, partly obscured by a snowdrift, lay a body. Dennis, a man no stranger to hardship, felt a cold dread clamp around his heart. He didn't stop. He sped home, the image seared into his mind. Bursting through the door, he gasped to his wife and urgently recounted what he had seen. He quickly enlisted his neighbor, Wesley Thorne, a stoic, calm man, to accompany him back to the scene. When Dennis and Wesley arrived, the reality was both stark and undeniable. A young woman was lying still in the snow, her vibrant clothing dulled by winter light. A patch of crimson marred her clothes and stood stark against the white. Without touching a thing, they drove to the nearest farmhouse, the Donovans, and called the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. The call was received by Sheriff Garrett Hines, a man whose face spoke volumes from years of experience. His voice tightened as he dispatched deputies to the remote location. When Officer Valerie Finch and Deputy Travis Lorne arrived, their breath plumed in the icy air. They confirmed Dennis and Wesley's grim discovery. The young woman was dead. A preliminary examination revealed she had multiple stab wounds, a brutal end in the silent wilderness. Yet one thing didn't add up. There wasn't that much blood saturating the snow. That would mean one harrowing possibility: she was killed somewhere else, and then left out in the open, coldly discarded at this desolate spot. Close by, half buried in the snow, Finch saw a man's knit cap, bright orange and black, stark in a broad white surround. It was out of place, a potential lead. Lying nearby was one cigarette butt, a red and white Marlboro. She bagged both as evidence. Shortly thereafter, forensic technician Warren Dade arrived and tried to cast tire tracks in the disturbed snow. The loose, powdery texture foiled his efforts. The tracks remained an elusive ghost of a clue. Beyond these few items, the scene offered little else. The body was taken to the Dunn County Medical Examiner's office. Meanwhile, Sheriff Hines and Detective Craig Koser, a seasoned investigator with a meticulous approach, conducted an interview with Dennis Brown. Dennis was in shock as he explained that the man he saw was white, slender, about 25 to 35 years old, approximately 5 feet 8 inches, light brown hair. He remembered the car as small, gold, a sedan, but the model and license plate were unknown. The county medical examiner, Dr. Octavia Reed, did the autopsy with great attention to detail. The victim had sustained about 15 stab wounds on her upper body and back. She died due to too much blood loss. Her arms were covered with a number of painful defensive wounds, which indicated she put up quite a fight. No sexual assault was evident, complicating the motive. Dr. Reed collected with care traces of blood and skin from beneath the fingernails of the victim, a potential goldmine of forensic evidence, and preserved several short strands of male hair found inside the distinctive knit cap. Detectives were doing their best to identify the body. Finally, they identified her. Mary Kathleen Schleeze, 25-year-old Minneapolis artist. That evening, Detective Koser delivered the devastating news to Michael and Penelope Schleeze. Their vibrant, adventurous daughter was gone. Moments later, Don Schleeze arrived to find his parents engulfed in grief, his own heart sinking under the weight of unimaginable loss. Early the following morning, the family drove to Dunn County, where they would identify Mary's body behind the cold pane of glass at the morgue. The once lively features lay still. The light of her spirit was extinguished. Detective Koser got in touch with Linnea Larson, Mary's roommate. Linnea confirmed Mary had planned to attend an art show in Chicago and had taken her purse, an item notably missing from the crime scene. Piecing together the timeline, detectives calculated that Mary had left her Minneapolis apartment around 10 a.m., and her body was discovered roughly 3 hours later. The drive from Minneapolis to the remote location in Dunn County would have taken about an hour and a half. It was an inescapable conclusion. The person who picked up Mary in Minneapolis was likely the same person who murdered her. Based on Dennis Brown's description, Kozer took the witness to see a sketch artist who drew a composite image of the suspect, a haunting approximation of a killer's face. The case files on Mary Kathleen Schleeze had been released to newspapers across Minnesota and Wisconsin, accompanied by pleas for public assistance. A few tips trickled in, but none offered concrete leads. Yet even as this fragmentary trail began to unfold, a quiet unease began to seep into the investigative team, turning their interest to their key eyewitness. Dennis Brown, Sheriff Garrett Hines, and Detective Craig Kozer couldn't shake a nagging feeling. Dennis had been on a remote dead-end road, a place few casual travelers would venture. No other witness had corroborated his sighting of the gold sedan or the man he described. And some parts of his story just didn't quite add up. Dennis said that on the day she vanished, he had gone to the store and then, on the way back, decided to keep driving. He took a turn onto the secluded dead-end road and explained the detour for an odd reason. His dog, his faithful companion, supposedly wanted a longer ride. The desolate location, together with the peculiar explanation, raised eyebrows among seasoned investigators. The first suspicious detail was what Dennis did right after he said he found the body. He hadn't gotten out of his truck, and he hadn't called the police from his home. Instead, he drove all the way back to fetch his neighbor, Wesley Thorne. Only after Wesley saw the body did they call the police. It almost seemed to Detective Kozer that Dennis was trying to build an alibi, or at least distance himself from the gruesome find by creating a shared witness experience. Still, there were some pieces of evidence that didn't point at Dennis. The faint tire tracks at the scene did not match his pickup truck. Though far from conclusive, it indicated another vehicle might have passed through, and investigators couldn't place Dennis in Minneapolis that morning when Mary was picked up, which made it unlikely he could have given her the first ride. Yet the possibility remained that Mary had taken a ride from someone else first and then ended up on the road where Dennis found her. Repeated questioning produced nothing new. Desperate to unlock even the smallest details, they called in Dr. Theron Vance, a prominent hypnotist. After 2 sessions, investigators were no closer to the solution of the mystery. Amid the sparse tips, one anonymous letter turned up at the sheriff's office. It urged investigators to look more closely at Dennis Brown as a suspect, but the letter contained no concrete evidence, only a vague, unsettling warning. With the Dennis lead frustratingly stalled, investigators turned their attention to any other possible avenues. That was when they came across an unsolved case. 2 years previously, a haunting echo that leaped right out at them. The case involved a 22-year-old Minneapolis woman named Jolie Trolson in 1972. She, too, had been hitchhiking, he learned. Her body turned up 15 hours later near a river on the outskirts of town. Detective Kozer couldn't help but be struck by some astonishing similarities. Both victims were last seen getting into a gold-colored car driven by a young man, and neither woman had been sexually assaulted. Despite these near-identical hallmarks, investigators weren't any closer to a suspect in Jolie's case either. Investigators scoured for any thread to connect the 2 cases, any common denominator pointing to a shared killer, but every lead proved to be a dead end. Several weeks after Mary's body was found, a young woman came forward. Harper Wynn, a 22-year-old college student with extensive experience hitchhiking, recounted an unnerving experience the afternoon of February 17th. 2 days after Mary's murder. She had been picked up by a long-haul truck driver on the same stretch of highway Mary likely traveled. Harper's voice was calm, but a quiet disquiet was betrayed as she told her story to Detective Kozer. I saw the news about the girl," she said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It reminded me of something that happened." She said she was picked up by a man named Walter Wally Henderson, a middle-aged, gruff, long-haul trucker who ran the Minneapolis to Chicago route. Harper remembered his truck vividly, a distinctive blue and white semi. Wally occasionally gave hitchhikers rides, often for companionship on lonely stretches. At first, he seemed nice. We talked for a while, about the weather, about college, Harper explained. The conversation flowed so easily that it was easy to get caught up in the false sense of rapport as the semi rumbled eastward through the fading winter light. They pulled into the Oasis Roadhouse, a sprawling diner just outside Eau Claire, Wisconsin. The comforting scent of coffee, griddle grease, and cigarette smoke filled the air. Wally insisted on buying her a meal. I looked hungry, Harper remembered, a faint smile touching her lips at the memory of the unexpected generosity. But once outside the diner, back on the open highway, Wally's demeanor began to shift subtly. His comments grew increasingly familiar. His jokes veered into inappropriate territory. At first, Harper let it go, thinking it was just trucker humor, but a growing sense of unease began settling in her stomach. The humor remained with Harper win from the ride, but a knot was beginning to tighten in her stomach. Finally, in the dim glow of the truck's dashboard, Wally plainly asked her to have sexual intercourse with him. Harper's heart pounded. She refused immediately. She said no, thank you, trying to keep her voice firm but polite. The pleasant facade Wally had maintained instantly crumbled. The glint of amiable mischief in his eyes hardened into a fierce, irritable glare. The air in the cab grew thick with menace. He just kept driving. Even when Harper whispered, her voice cracking, that she wanted to get out, he stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Terrified, Harper made a desperate, impulsive decision. She unzipped her jacket, leaned precariously out the passenger window, and started waving it frantically. A white flag against the encroaching darkness, in a wild hope that another passing motorist might see it. The sudden, desperate action took Wally by surprise. With a curse, he braked hard and turned into the next filling station, a lone, dimly lit outpost further down the highway. Without a word, he ordered her out. Harper shook, gathered up her backpack, and fled, not looking back. But before she left the truck, one detail snagged in her memory: his arms, scratched up like he'd been in a fight or had run through a thorny bush. Her account was chilling and detailed. Immediately, Walter Henderson was catapulted to the top of Detective Koser's suspect list. The timing, the route, the description of a gold sedan. None was as concrete as this terrifying close-up encounter by someone named Harper. Sheriff Garrett Hines immediately ordered a full investigation. Finding a long-haul truck driver from 1974 was no easy task, but due to diligent checks with trucking companies and common truck stop networks, they traced Wally to a dispatch in Chicago. Deputy Landon Pierce and Officer Valerie Finch finally caught up with Henderson at a truck yard in Illinois, where he was preparing for another long haul. Wally was powerfully built, his face rough-hewn from years on the road, eyes weary. His blue and white semi sat idling nearby, exactly as Harper had described. Mr. Henderson, we'd like to ask you a few questions about a recent trip you made through Wisconsin, Detective Koser said calmly but firmly. In the interrogation room, Wally sat with his arms crossed, gaze unreadable. Koser explained the murder of Mary Kathleen Schleeze. Wally reported he gave Harper a ride but adamantly denied anything bad happened, saying it had been just chit-chat. He grunted that she had gotten squirrely, and he dropped her off. When asked to explain the scratches on his arms, Wally had a bizarre answer. Syphilis. It itches like hell, always scratching myself. He mumbled, refusing to meet their eyes. Koser and Hines exchanged glances of skepticism. The lie was transparent. A search of Wally's semi, conducted with a warrant, yielded further unsettling clues. Under the passenger seat, officers found a stack of well-worn adult magazines, hidden as if deliberately concealed. Confronted, Wally became increasingly defensive. He scoffed when asked to take a polygraph. Ain't no way, he said, shaking his head. Cops always looking for a fall guy. Don't trust them one bit. His refusal, along with evasive answers, deepened the suspicion of the investigators. Yet Wally's story never changed. Even after 2 weeks in detention and relentless questioning, he insisted he was hundreds of miles away, delivering a load in Ohio. Detectives patiently checked his alibi, cross-referencing entries of a logbook against fuel receipts and delivery manifests. Day after day, the evidence began to gel. Finally, the truth had come out. Wally Henderson had been hundreds of miles away on February 15th, 1974. He wasn't Mary's killer. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office was plunged back into the chilling vacuum of an unsolved murder. The initial flurry of activity, the interrogations, the tantalizing leads had dissolved into frustrating dead ends. Even the haunting parallels with Jolie Trulson's unsolved 1972 murder, a young hitchhiker from Minneapolis, a gold-colored car, no sexual assault, a body dumped in a rural area, yielded no new connections. Interviews with Jolie's friends, Glenn Jenkins and Clara Thompson, reiterated that she had gotten into a gold sedan, but nothing else concretely linked the two cases. The winter of 1974 remained dark for the investigators, with the killer's identity elusive and hope just out of grasp. The witnesses described a gold sedan, but their descriptions of the driver were too vague to match Dennis Brown's composite or provide a new lead. Every attempt to link the murder of Mary Schleeze to Jolie Trulson's case ended in frustration. As weeks bled into a relentless Minnesota spring, tips dried up, and the initial fervor of the investigation began to cool. Mary's brother, Don Schlee, haunted the sheriff's office, desperate for news while Sheriff Garrett Hines and Detective Craig Koser could offer little beyond weary reassurances. The composite drawing of the suspect, a stark, unsettling face, remained unrecognized, slowly fading onto the back pages of local papers. Then, just as the case was about to slide completely into the cold files, a new lead came from St. Croix County, Wisconsin. Kathy Hobley, a meticulous homemaker, saw the sketch in a local newspaper. Her heart seized. The face bore a haunting resemblance to her reclusive neighbor, Leonard "Lenny" Croft. Days passed as Kathy argued with her conscience until she finally dialed the St. Croix County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Larry Sanders listened intently as she described Croft. A slender, slightly tall man in his late 20s, living a withdrawn life on the outskirts of St. Quentin, married, but largely absent from public view, with a 10-year-old son often playing alone in the yard. Most compellingly, Kathy mentioned that Croft owned a small faded yellow sedan, not gold, but close enough in certain light conditions to demand immediate attention. Realizing the gravity of what he had been told, Deputy Sanders passed the tip to Detective Koser in the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. A few days later, Koser and Officer Valerie Finch crossed the county line into St. Croix and found Croft's address, a small, weather-beaten house tucked down a gravel lane. The yellow sedan sat haphazardly in the driveway. Lenny Croft came out, holding a small-sized trash bag. His suspicious eyes moved around skittishly as the officers reached him. "Mr. Croft, Leonard Croft?" Koser started, composed, flashing his badge. "Detective Koser with the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. This is Officer Finch from St. Croix County. If you have a minute, we'd like to ask you a few questions." Lenny nodded slowly, clutching the bag, his eyes fixed on the ground. Koster calmly began, "Where were you on the morning of Friday, February 15th? Croft's face turned pale. I don't remember. I think I was either at home or doing local deliveries," he muttered in a vague and evasive way. Koser detected the faint but unmistakable whiff of tobacco on him. "You smoke, Mr. Croft?" Lenny finally met his eyes, a flicker of suspicion in his own. "Sometimes, yeah." "You smoke Marlboro Reds too?" Koser asked casually, masking the weight of the question. Croft's shoulders relaxed fractionally, a hint of pride in his hesitant reply. "Marlboro Red is my preferred brand." A small, almost imperceptible nod passed between Koser and Finch. The cigarette butt found at Mary's crime scene, a Marlboro Red, now had a potential owner. "Mind if we step aside and talk for a moment?" Koser suggested, gesturing to the edge of the driveway, away from the yellow sedan. Lenny, increasingly uneasy, complied. Officer Finch did a slow, careful circle around the car, crouching once to note the tire make and tread pattern. From her coat pocket, she drew a small notepad, jotting measurements roughly against the span of her hand. Every movement was quiet, deliberate, and practiced. Although Croft's indefinite answers, his brand of cigarettes, and the tire observation were grounds for no immediate arrest, Koser felt a grim satisfaction. The web was tightening. On the drive back, Finch whispered her observation. The sedan's tires matched the size and tread pattern of the elusive tracks collected at the crime scene, by forensic technician Warren Date Inside. Kozer knew the net was closing, and the evidence mounted over the next few days. A man fitting the suspect's description, a yellow car that could be mistaken for gold, a Marlboro red cigarette with a link to the crime scene, and tire tracks like those at the scene. Lenny Croft's nervous demeanor and evasive answers during their informal questioning sealed it. A warrant for his arrest was swiftly issued, ratcheting up pressure on the Minneapolis Police Department and the Dunn County Sheriff's Office Chief James C. Crawford of the Minnesota State Patrol prepared to coordinate as the decades-old investigation finally appeared poised to break wide open.